Chapter 14. Often called the Queen of the Danube, Vienna, Austria lies on the Danube, river, at a point where almost all European trade routes cross. It is a great port, trading center, a manufacturing city, and a city of immense history and drama. It is one other thing as well. It is arguably the espionage capital of the world. A recent study by the National Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board estimated that 1 out of every 6 spies in the world either works or is based in Vienna. Being the only city in the world with embassies from every United Nations member, as well as over 30 legations from liberation movements, a day hardly goes by without one intrigue or another. The center of Vienna is called the Inner City, with wide boulevards built where the ancient city walls once stood, and the Ringstrasse with its scores of parks circling the many international and local government buildings. The Inner City invariably draws every visitor to Vienna at least once during their trip, including those in and on the periphery of international espionage. At the center of the Inner City, just southwest of Vienna's most famous building, the 450-foot-high St. Stephen's Cathedral, lies the Rathaus. A Gothic building in the center of a small park, its clock tower reaches over 320 feet in the air, and its walls contain the city library, the historical museum, and off to one side, the world's most famous historical collection of weapons. And among that collection, every Monday and Thursday morning from 9 to noon, sits Abd al-Qadir Yaman ibn Musa Abu Khayyat, counterfeit document dealer to the world. In his $2,000 Italian suits, $500 shoes, and expensive daily hairstyling, he sits in front of the exhibits of 16th century firearms, quietly reading his London Times. As the clock in the tower above him chimes for the 12th time at noon, he stands, carefully folds his paper, places it in his calfskin briefcase, and leaves, along with whoever had been sent from whatever intelligence service that day to watch him. He didn't mind the surveillance, not really. His clients, many of those same intelligence services that watched him so closely, knew better than to come themselves. In fact, it was said that Abd al-Qadir, as he was known to his intimates, alone supported the bulk of the thriving intermediary business in Vienna. He was not surprised when a man quietly sat down next to him on that Monday morning. He continued reading his paper. "We have some business acquaintance in common? Our America." "Go on." Abd al-Qadir turned the page of his paper. "Navinko." The document dealer nodded slightly. "And?" "Florida Meridian Air." Abd al-Qadir frowned as he continued to read. The names were good ones, organs of U.S. intelligence that he had dealt with in the past, but none of them in the last 5 years. "They strike a nostalgic tone," he said as he glanced at the man next to him. He was in his 40s with longish hair, a clumpy beard, and large sunglasses beneath a battered felt fedora. Not one of his regulars. The man remained silent. "Very well," Abd al-Qadir finally said. "You may place the order, but I will require a larger than normal advance." "Agreed." The man put a small slip of paper on the bench between them. Casually, Abd al-Qadir picked it up, unfolded it with one hand, then held it behind his paper. "The travel documents are routine enough, 1,965 Deutschmarks apiece. The birth certification and baptismal documents say 982 Deutschmarks each." He paused. "The other two They are going to be problematic. The man didn't react. Abd al-Qadir got a very strange feeling from that. There were always negotiations over the difficult documents. But, Abd al-Qadir said after a time, I have my resources. I will have to charge a premium, however. Fine. 6,550 Deutschmarks each. And they'll stand up to a computer search. Of course. He did the calculations in his head. 3 travel documents, the birth records, and the others. He paused. 20,959 Deutschmarks, or 15,000 American. The man smiled for the first time. I didn't know you gave discounts. He placed a small envelope on the bench. Photos, the name, the histories, instructions on delivery, also 10,000 marks. The remaining $7,366.41 in American currency on delivery. Abd al-Qadir picked up the envelope, agreed. How long? 10 days, no less. The special request will take time to process. The man thought for a moment, then stood up. 10 days. He walked away, carefully examining the ancient broadswords, suits of armor, and shields as he went. A pair of young lovers, obviously unable to take in anything other than each other, drifted out behind him. On the steps of the Rathaus, they stopped, the young woman posing against one of the ornate columns as her husband or boyfriend took her picture. With a close-up of the man who had met with Abd al-Qadir as the dominant feature of the photo. He's in Vienna. The sergeant came running into Kilgore's office. What? The young man held out the photograph taken in front of the Rathaus. Greek intelligence spotted him making a deal with a paper dealer in Vienna. Kilgore examined the photo with a magnifying glass. It could be him, he said carefully. It gets better, the sergeant virtually gushed. Their people on the ground followed him for a while. They were able to recover a paper cup he used. Fingerprints are conclusive. He handed the report to Kilgore. It had been 3 weeks since the debacle at the grocery, since the embarrassing raid at Dr. Nelwyn's house, since the discovery of Conrad Edel's body. The porn dealer had been interrogated by the search team and German authorities. Other than the name Karan Apollyon, he'd yielded nothing of importance. Everything in the grocery had been examined, dissected, and interpreted. Specialists in art interpretation had been brought in to examine the mural before it had been cut from the wall and removed to the Institute for further study. Patricia had submitted to hypnosis, then every aspect of her confrontation with Newman had been deliberated and analyzed. Her house had been gone over 3 times for even the slightest amounts of trace evidence, but no trace of Newman could be found. There was one other issue that also remained floating in the air. Would Newman follow through on his nuclear threat if he discovered that they were still actively pursuing him? They'd taken every possible precaution to avoid discovering that answer. Patricia had supervised the funeral for Edel in his churchyard near a group of juniper bushes. They had all attended. The Premier of the Federal Republic of Germany had made a speech about men on walls. The minister had talked of final rewards, and Dr. Tabbert had spoken of efficiency and dignity. Throughout, Kilgore had watched the rooftops, the windows across the street, the crowd of media and onlookers, hoping to find the face he felt certain must be there somewhere. They had made a great show of breaking down the headquarters in the barn, ostentatiously pulled their men and equipment out of the Institute. They'd massively lowered their profile across the board, but they had far from abandoned the search. In a highly secured hangar at Rhinesgarth Air Base, they continually processed all the leads they could come up with, now that they were in their covert mode. They met secretly with staff from the Institute, trying to put together a psychological profile of Newman, aka Apollyon, and they had circulated a worldwide communique to all arms of American intelligence. Newman had become the #1 priority among all other intelligence demands. Wanted, dead or alive. But that had all been 3 weeks ago and nothing since. Not until this young sergeant had come bursting in with the Viennese photograph. Kilgore walked out to the analysis room where 5 others were examining copies of the photograph and fingerprints. Well, the lieutenant looked up. It's him, no question. Kilgore still hesitated to act. In the 56 days that Newman had been at large, he had yet to make even the slightest mistake, even with them tracking him to the grocery. There, Dr. Kapp was convinced Newman wanted his mural seen, would have led them to it if they hadn't found him. No mistake. But Kapp had been cautionary when Kilgore had brought the point up. If, the elderly professor had said, Newman's personality has become submerged into the psychosis of Apollyon, it is possible that he will begin to become slightly erratic, and an erratic man makes mistakes. An erratic man makes mistakes. 1 in 56 days. He allows himself to be observed meeting with a known documents dealer in an environment about as far from secure as possible in the most dangerous city in Europe. It seemed all so remarkably convenient, yet it also seemed possible. Kilgore turned to his liaison officer. Can we lean on the paper bug? Negative, the man said. He's on the protected list. Kilgore looked over at his second-in-command. Well, the man shrugged. We were due for some luck, he paused, but it is awfully lucky. Kilgore took a few steps away as he thought it over. Finally, after about a minute, he turned around decisively. Bob, he said to his deputy, take a forward logistics team and 2 scout units to Vienna, set up a forward CP, and begin the initial search. I want a full hazard assessment in 36 hours. The man nodded and hurried out to another office. Kilgore turned back to the liaison officer. Make plans to move the whole team out on 2 hours' notice. Make whatever preliminary contacts you have to in Austria. Kilgore continued on to his office door. And somebody get me Dr. Kapp on the phone. 64 kilometers away, a little under an hour's drive, Tabbert pulled out of the Institute's driveway on his way home. For the first time in days, Brian Newman was not on his mind. Hadn't even come up during the long, trying day. That, to Talbert, made it a very good day after all. But there had been crises. Jack Clemente had entered the final stages of his battle with the cancer. Tabbert felt sorry for him, but was more deeply concerned about who would replace him. The board wanted to promote from within, meaning he suspected Patricia Nelwyn. He would never allow that to happen. His plan was to hire from abroad, but he was meeting strong resistance. Also, the board of directors was considering expanding the Institute's facilities by clear-cutting almost half of the woods. Now, loud, obnoxious members of Germany's Greens Party were starting to show up, chaining themselves to trees and chanting for the news cameras. At a facility that prided itself on its discretion and privacy, this could be a disaster. Then there was the problem of insurance carriers. 3 major carriers, in fact, who had all decided to drop the Volker Institute from their accepted list due to the exorbitant charges. Tabbert spent 3 full hours in meetings on this problem alone. It wasn't that the Institute really needed the business of those carriers, who made up less than 7% of the adjusted gross anyway. No, it was the principle of the thing. The Volcker Institute, the People's Institute, always prided itself on the number of community patients it accepted every year. It added to the image that Talbot had worked so hard to craft in the last 9 years. So he would fight any attempt to force them to cut back there. A day of crises, but none involving Brian Newman. So he smiled as he drove. He slowed as he pulled up to the 1-lane bridge that crossed the tributary of the Isar near his home. A car was in front of him, so he waited, as the law demanded, for it to cross first, as the bridge passage light flashed green for traffic from this direction. But instead, it just sat. He shook his head at the stupidity of most drivers, then honked his horn. Still no movement. He honked again, then turned at a knocking on the glass of his driver's side door. The man was standing so close that Tabbert could only make out his torso. He seemed to be looking over the top of the Mercedes touring car. "Was ist los?" Tabbert asked. A muffled response. "Idiot," Tabbert murmured as he lowered the window. The man started to bend down to him. "Was ist?" He never finished the question, as a rag soaked in chlorpromazine covered his face, instantly rendering him unconscious. 35 minutes later, he slowly came to. "Good evening," a male voice said from nearby. Tabbert's vision was still cloudy, his head was throbbing, and he was sick to his stomach. "What is going on?" he demanded in German. "I am an important man. You had better release me immediately." He heard steps come toward him, then flinched as a cool, damp rag was applied to his face. The male voice spoke again. "Blink it into your eyes. It'll help." Tabbert did as he was told, then slowly opened his eyes as he felt it being removed. "My gosh." Newman shook his head. "I wish you people would stop saying that." "What? How?" Tabbert stuttered. "I have some questions for you," Newman said flatly. Tabbert began to pull himself together as the initial shock wore off. "I will tell you nothing. Now release me at once." "Who's the tall Russian you meet with at the Hofkeller in the Reich district?" The fear deepened, as did Tabbert's resolve not to say anything. He firmly clenched his jaw. Newman pulled his chair closer to the bound man. "Now, Manfred," he said in a casual, friendly voice, "we both know that you're going to tell me everything I want to know. Why not make it easy on yourself?" He pulled a large hunting knife from a scabbard in his boot. "The Hofkeller in the Reich district, a tall Russian man who deals in icons and antiques. Remember?" Tabbert couldn't take his eyes off the blade of the knife as it reflected the light of the one bare light bulb in the room. "Please," he said weakly, his momentary strength evaporating as each flash of light shot off the highly polished blade. "Please, I know nothing." "You know anatomy." Newman's voice was still casual, but beginning to flatten out like a tape running down. He reached out, quickly undoing Tabbert's trousers. He pulled them and the boxer shorts down to the man's ankles. Tabbert struggled against his bonds, wanted to scream, to shout for help. All he could manage was a weak whimper. "It'll go like this," Newman continued. "None of the cuts will be lethal. All will be immediately treated and bandaged. I will then wait an hour or so for you to sufficiently recover, then repeat the process." He paused, bringing his face to within inches of Tabbert's. "You're a doctor. You know how many things I can slice up. He dropped the blade of his knife until it touched Tabert's exposed penis, or cut off without causing death. Tabert tried to pull back, tried to make the chair topple over backward, but Newman reached out and grabbed the flaccid organ in his hand and gripped it tight. "No!" Tabert screamed. Newman made a very light incision on the top of the top member. The Hofkeller in the Reich district, a tall Russian man who deals in icons and antiques. Remember? In the electronically secured conference room at the Institute, Cap shook his head as he hung up the phone. "The chief must have stopped on the way home," he said. "I suggest we proceed without him." "Okay," Kilgore said as he settled himself at the table. He looked over at Patricia, who quickly looked down at the file. He smiled. "Dr. Nelwyn, you want to start?" She nodded tersely. "Right." She flipped through some pages in the file. "We have two things here, really. First, why is he in Austria? Second, what are his intentions? Where is he going? And how will he try to get there?" "So," Kilgore said, "you're convinced all of this is genuine, not some kind of trick?" She nodded, still without looking at him. "Of course. Why shouldn't it be?" She paused. "He's on the run. We're only a couple of hours from the Austrian border here. It's the logical first move, and logic is the dominant force in this man." "I disagree." All eyes turned to Cap. "Dr. Cap," Kilgore said. Cap shook his head. "Logic is not what drives this man. Passion is." "Don't be absurd, Otto," Patricia chuckled. Kilgore held up a restraining hand. "Go ahead, doctor." "Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean passion as you know it." He smiled cynically. "Nothing about Newman, Apollyon if you prefer, is what conventional science would call normal, but nevertheless he is a man driven by passion." "Which means," Kilgore asked, "which means that Newman/Apollyon will not leave, at least not permanently, until he has completed the task that his passion undoubtedly demands." "You don't believe the reports, then?" Kilgore said glumly. Cap shrugged. "Whether he has been in Vienna, is still there, or not, it makes no difference." He paused. "He will be back. He will feel compelled to finish what others have started." Patricia finally looked up, smiling patronizingly. "That is," her voice was laced with good-natured sarcasm, "avenging his friend." He said it flatly, like it was an established fact. "Unbelievable," Patricia said as she suppressed a smile. Kilgore noticed. "Dr. Nelwyn?" This time she returned Kilgore's gaze. "The last first. Newman, not Newman/Apollyon, but Newman, is incapable of forming any friendships, let alone one of sufficient closeness and intimacy that the removal of it would drive him to a homicidal rage, especially with the man who he must view as his chief incarcerator. In point of fact, he is completely incapable of any such rage. He is virtually emotionless, cold, removed, remote, capable of aping genuine emotion when it serves him, but incapable of ever truly feeling it." She consulted her notes. "Passion? Never. Not in that man. Not ever." She took a deep breath before continuing. "He could have, should have, killed or raped me at the very least when he had the opportunity. A passionate man would have." Kilgore looked away as he remembered the feel of her bare skin against his hand when he had untied her legs that day. "That I'm still here," she continued, relatively unbruised, "is testimony that the man is completely dispassionate." Cap shook his head. "He did not rape you, so he is dispassionate. If he had raped you, you would call him a sexual psychopath. He paused, looking seriously at Patricia. What you are still not realizing, child, is that in either case, he would still be the same man. His purpose in visiting you was to deliver a message, nothing more. Everything was or would have been, as you Americans are so fond of saying, simply window dressing. Kilgore always felt uncomfortable when these shrinks began to get off on their weird tangents. Can we get back to the issue at hand? Patricia glanced at him, then looked back at Cap. Look, she said cajolingly, at some point we're all going to have to sit down and accept that Brian Newman is the next wave, the next generation of man. Lane Fenton wrote about it 30 years ago. Living things change in special ways, and chief among these is the reality that whole races grow old, just as individuals do. Cap shook his head. Professor Lane Fenton's theories have never been generally accepted by the scientific community. Patricia shrugged. They have been by me. She turned to Kilgore. We've had 300,000 years. It's time we can see the inevitable and try to live alongside it as long as we can. She stood up, then began to pace. Dr. Cap, and believe me when I say how much I admire him, is just not capable of understanding this man. Cap seemed amused. Indeed. May I ask why? I think you should. She turned to Kilgore. At the grocery, he said it himself. Dr. Cap grew up in war and post-war Germany, the product of one of the most disciplined conservative societies in the world's history. His age, socialization, cultural nexus all force him into conventional answers to unconventional questions. Fascinating, Cap said quietly, a touch of sadness in his voice. Patricia continued, talking directly to Kilgore. Dr. Cap had referred to Homo crudelis, cold-hearted man. Let's get that straight before we go any further. She turned to Cap. That's almost right on. Newman is not hampered by the petty moralities, conventions, or mores that we are. He is completely free to do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. If somebody should try to stop him, she shrugged, it wouldn't matter any more to him than the pigeon or the cat. She paused. That's all we are to him, or all we should be. She was beginning to speak in an excited, speeded-up voice. Erectus couldn't stand up for long to Sapiens because he didn't have the brain power. We won't be able to stand up to the Newmans because we remain crippled by these stupid, superfluous, inbred handicaps we so haughtily call emotions and morality. Cap looked at her without blinking. So Crudelis becomes the dominant creature as Homo sapiens slowly but surely dies out. She walked over to him, leaning her hands on the table, her every sinew begging for Cap to understand. Not Crudelis, not cold-hearted man, she paused. Homo superbus, superior man? Cap asked softly. Patricia nodded. Homo superbus. Stapleton saw it coming almost 70 years ago. Think of it. She seemed to drift off for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was dreamlike. All the things we screwed up, all the things we couldn't do, we considered them wrong or immoral. Population control leading to feeding the hungry. Scientific advances at a breakneck pace. No more wars, no more hatred, no more discrimination. Cap sadly nodded. I have heard this all before, he said, looking directly at her. As you have pointed out. Patricia looked blank. You are in illustrious company, Dr. Nowin, he said as he stood up, sweeping his papers into his briefcase. She nodded. Stapleton, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. Cap opened the door, then turned back to her, disappointment and something akin to anger in his eyes. "Eichmann," he said. Mengele, Speer, Himmler, and of course Hitler. He paused. Quite illustrious company. Patricia froze, the stunned expression slowly spreading across her face. Cap turned to Kilgore. "You have my opinion, Captain," he said quietly. "Please excuse me." He closed the door behind him. Patricia stood there staring at the closed door. "He doesn't understand," she muttered so softly that Kilgore could barely make it out. "He doesn't understand." Kilgore's mind was swimming. He'd come for help in deciding how best to track a fugitive, then found himself knee-deep in a philosophy debate. He sighed deeply. "Dr. Nelwyn?" She slowly turned to him. "Dr. Nelwyn, if I can cut through the third-year philosophy class." She walked over and began gathering her things. "Where," he said in an exasperated voice, "where do I find Newman?" She picked up her things, heading for the door. "I'm going to Vienna." She headed out into the corridor. "He just doesn't understand," she muttered as she went. Kilgore stood up, took a deep breath in, gathered his papers. He was a strong man, an honest, hard-working, moral man, and he didn't think of himself as weak because of that. But he did think of himself as alone. Almost at the very moment that Kilgore sat down with the psychiatrist to discuss what to do about Newman, Runoff was holding a similar consultation in his hotel suite. The tall man had delivered intercepted copies of the Greek intelligence, and together they sat down and pored over it. "I know Abd al-Qadir," the tall man said. "He won't talk, even if we were allowed to question him." "The quality of his work, is it that good?" Runoff asked. The tall man nodded. "If Newman receives whatever documents he has ordered, he will most certainly vanish completely from sight." Runoff sighed. "What do we have available in Vienna?" "Black, brown, and purple networks, as well as a cut-down Spetsnaz commando unit at our UN mission. I have taken the liberty of putting them on alert." "Good," Runoff said. He paused. "Captain Kilgore has been less than forthcoming since the foolishness at the grocery. What do we know of his intentions?" The tall man shrugged. "I've been trying to reach Madalena with no success as yet. I want to talk to him before we leave." "Yes, sir," the tall man said as he poured himself another glass of wine. Then there was a knock at the door. Runoff looked at him. "The fool isn't stupid enough to contact us here, is he?" The tall man nodded reluctantly. He stood up and walked to the door. "Who?" he asked at the closed door. "Madalena," came the high-pitched reply. The tall man angrily shook his head. He apparently is that stupid. He unlocked and opened the door. Runoff heard a muffled popping sound, turning in time to see the tall man crumble to the floor as the door closed. "Colonel," Newman pointed the Tokarev at Runoff's eyes and walked deeper into the room. Runoff didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't make the slightest sound. He just stared at the man behind the gun and thought of all the things he would never do. "It's been a long time," Newman said as he sat down opposite Runoff. He lowered the gun to his lap. "Not long enough, I think." Newman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're developing a sense of irony late in life," he said, as he examined the wine bottle. He curled his lip distastefully. "Vinegar." Runoff fought against trembling. "Shall I beg for my life?" Newman shrugged. "It wouldn't help." He sniffed at the tall man's wineglass, then put it down, shaking his head. I will give you a choice, though. He looked Runoff in the eyes. You can die painlessly, or not. Runoff took a deep breath. What do you want? How did you find me? Runoff licked his lips nervously. I knew you would not leave yourself without a way out. He gestured at the tall man who lay dead on the floor. He knew of the old fascist tunnel system. It was part of his assignment to know such things. I ordered men to all of the most isolated exits. He paused. That I was at the one you emerged from was sheer luck. Bad luck. So it would appear. Newman's eyes narrowed as his voice dropped low and cold. Why'd you kill Conrad Edel? The security man? Newman didn't react, just raised the Tokarev to eye level. Why? An unfortunate accident. I was aiming at you. Newman studied the man closely for a long time. All right, he said softly. He pulled the trigger once, watching as Runoff was thrown out of his chair by the heavy impact of the Tokarev slug into his brain. He was dead before he hit the floor, painlessly. 10 minutes after midnight, the Institute having settled down to its normal late-night rhythms, Cap, assisted by an orderly, carried several cardboard boxes into his office. He piled them in a corner as the orderly unloaded rolls of tape and string from his pockets. Call me if you need anything else, Doctor. Cap waved the young man away as he began to sort through his files, putting some in a box, leaving others in the drawers. A few minutes into the job, he looked up as Patricia walked in. Can I help you, Dr. Nolan? His voice was calm, relaxed, decided. Jack Clemente's dead. Cap nodded silently. It seems he just stopped breathing when no one was around, she said matter-of-factly. Cap steadied himself on his desk. There is a merciful force in the universe. She shivered. Wow, it's cold in here tonight. The heating is not working properly. Again. She looked at the boxes. What's going on? He resumed packing. I am leaving this place. Patricia hesitated, then took a step forward. Why? Was it my... Jack Clemente was right. Your arrogance is indeed a marvel to behold. He paused, forcing up a bitter smile. I would not leave because of a disagreement in diagnosis. She seemed to want to say something, but couldn't quite figure out how. Things got a little out of control back at the meeting. We all said things we didn't really mean. Cap began loading his desk articles into a box. Indeed, I meant everything I said. He looked at her in the eye, and I believe you did as well. Patricia looked at him, then sat down on the couch. So, you think I'm a Nazi? I think you are arrogant and naive, a most dangerous combination. A silence settled between them. Finally, Patricia looked up and tried to smile. So, why are you leaving? Cap turned to the book stacked on his windowsill. There is nothing here for me anymore. As you have pointed out, I am old. Perhaps I sometimes think the oldest human being on this planet. It may well be time for, what did you call it, the next wave? It may well be time for the next wave to take their place at the table. He looked out the window at a lightly falling snow. I am merely opening up a seat. Look, Patricia said, standing and taking a step toward him. I've got no tact. I'm abrupt, impolite, and sometimes don't have the sense God gave a turnip, but that doesn't mean you have to leave. She paused. Come with me to Vienna. When we recapture Newman, we can find out, together, what he is and where man is going. Her eyes were alive with the excitement of the hunt. Cap shook his head. Captain Kilgore has received orders to assassinate Newman when he is found, he said flatly. I know, she said softly. Help me fight them. No. Why not? She said in an anxious voice. He didn't answer for a very long time. He seemed to be studying something on the lawn beneath his window. Why not? She tried again. Kath suddenly turned and started out of the office in a hurry. Because I agree with them. He rushed downstairs, leaving the Institute's main building through a back door. Ignoring the falling snow and growing cold, he walked straight across the lawn toward Unit A-249, where it had all begun. He stopped under the tree where Beck's men had been killed. It is dangerous for you to be here, he said quietly to a figure in the shadows. Newman shrugged. The world is a dangerous place. He slowly walked over to Kath. I just wanted to say goodbye. We won't see each other again. I know. Newman noticed that the old man was shivering in his shirt sleeves. He took off his jacket and put it around Kath's shoulders. You should take better care of yourself, he said to the elderly man. You ain't as young as springtime anymore. Kath stared into the younger man's eyes. So I have been told. He paused. Where will you go? Home, I guess. Where is that? That's to find out. What will you do? Newman smiled with a sparkle in his eyes. Don't you know? Kath remained silent. Consider, speculate, study, Newman finally said. Kath nodded. In search of yourself, he said in a strong voice. No, Newman said softly. In search of others like me. He paused. Like you. Kath straightened. Me? Lie to others if you like, but not to me, brother. Kath studied the firmness of the jaw, the confident light in the eyes, then nodded slowly. You know. It was a statement, not a question. I didn't know. Then I knew. How? I just did. Kath turned his back on Newman. Very well, he said in a hushed, emotion-choked voice. I told them you were insane, he said at last. Then you understood my portrait. I understood. Newman walked around in front of Kath. I won't spend the rest of my life on display for charlatans and mountebanks like the good Dr. Melwin. She means well. Newman ignored him. And I will not spend the rest of my life in hiding. I had to make sure that they wouldn't try and take me alive. Kilgore has his orders to shoot on sight, Kath said softly. Of course, Newman said. Brian Newman has gone round the bend, convinced himself he's some avenging angel from hell's depths out to destroy mankind. His voice was tinged with amusement. The DoD just can't allow that kind of behavior from one of its assets. He laughed lightly. Kath looked at him sadly. I looked into that portrait, then looked into myself. Then I knew. The only way they would ever stop looking is if they had killed you themselves, he paused. It is what I would have done. Newman smiled. Family ties. Kath looked at Newman with a deep pain coming from somewhere inside of his very being. What are we? He asked. Don't you know? Newman said gently. Kath barely shook his head. For the majority of my 78 years, I have asked that question. I have fought the temptations, the desires, the hatred, the frustration. I imposed my own personal discipline, then accepted the disciplines of my country and my profession. I have lived the life of an ascetic, being always vigilant to never allow a lapse, a vagrant moment, when what is within me might become loosed. He paused. But I have found no answers. What was it Dr. Melwin said? That we were the next evolutionary stage of man. He laughed easily. I think you called it Homo Credelis? Kath nodded sadly. Very poetic of you, the young man said lightly. He smiled warmly and put his arm around the old man. We're not the next step, not even close to it. No? No. Newman turned Kef to face him. Maybe a half step, maybe even less than that, but I'm fairly certain that we're still Homo sapiens. He laughed again. A friend asked me what I was not too very long ago. Newman seemed to drift off for a moment. What did you say? Newman looked back at Kef. Homo sapiens saevus. Kef smiled for the first time. The savage wise man, a half step indeed. Newman looked around, noticed that people in groups of 2 or 3 seemed to be randomly walking on the lawn, out for a night's walk in the snow, perhaps, but moving toward them nonetheless, slowly encircling them. The question is, he said as he began to stretch his legs and upper arms, a half step in what direction? Evolution or de-evolution? Forward or back? Kef noticed the people for the first time. You have thought this through? Newman nodded. As man evolves, he's slowly losing his little toe and little finger, he said absently as he watched the slowly approaching, still and distinct people over Kef's shoulder. If he de-evolves, they'll grow longer, he paused. I guess that's how we'll know which way we're going. Kef looked at him, a tear trickling down his cheek. And which do you think it is? He asked, trying to ignore what was about to happen. I'll let you know, brother, Newman said as he took a step away from Kef. He looked out at the 15 or 20 people in a semicircle around him. Farewell. He sprinted off to his left. Instantly, floodlights came on, illuminating every inch of the back lawn in an unrelenting brilliance. Shouts were raised back and forth as the American search team spread out, not firing, but steadily closing the circle around their quarry. Watch him, watch him. He's heading for the woods. Close it off, close it off. Watch him, don't expose yourself, take it slow. Newman zigzagged across the lawn, changing directions randomly, but keeping the same general course. He ran at his top speed, bent over, low to the ground, his head down. Watch the fence, damn it, he's heading for the fence. 5 black uniformed men fell to fully prone firing position between Newman and the east fence. Effortlessly, he shifted direction one more time. Where's he going? Damn it, cut him off. His mind was clear, precise, functioning, analyzing, seeing everything and playing out each possible permutation. 100 meters, he thought, 90 meters. The first shot slashed out at him from behind. He instantly dropped to his knees, rolled once, then came up running again. A Humvee came rolling onto the lawn to his right. He could hear the snap of its .50 caliber belt-fed machine gun being cocked above the noise of the pursuing soldiers. 50 meters. The heavy ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk of the .50 caliber rose above the din as large divots were dug up from the lawn in front of him from the great man-killer slugs of the heavy automatic weapon. I guess they don't want me going in there, he had time to think. 30 meters more. Another burst from the .50 caliber caught him in the right calf, knocking him over. They'll stop, he thought. Stop, look to see, pause. The firing stopped. Wait, Newman thought, a little longer. Now. He jumped to his feet and with a final burst of speed threw himself through the heating plant's open doorway just ahead of a new burst from the .50 caliber. Hold it! Newman could hear Kilgore's voice coming from the direction of the Humvee. Second squad, around the back, nobody fire, you hear me? Nobody fire. We've got natural gas lines and stored petrol in there. Hold your fire, damn it. Newman forced himself to his feet, ignoring his heavily bleeding leg. His mind was clear, the pain was tolerable. He was calm, collected, exactly where he wanted to be. He pulled himself toward the center of the heating plant, to the great pipe that carried the superheated air from the powerful natural gas furnaces below him to the main building. "Brian Newman," Kilgore called through a bullhorn. "Brian Newman, come out with your hands above your head and you will not be harmed." Newman found the box that he left by the pipe hours before. He opened the lid and began to throw switches. Charan Apayan, this is Captain John Kilgore of the United States Army. Come out with your hands above your head and you will not be harmed. Kilgore turned to a sergeant standing beside him behind the Humvee. Entry teams to access points. The sergeant nodded and spoke softly into his headset. "Charan Apayan," Kilgore said into the speaker's microphone. "If you come out now, we can work all this." He was cut off by two small roars, followed by a low rumble. Then, as if the earth itself was vomiting forth hellfire and brimstone, a fireball broke loose from the small building. It carried with it an explosion that knocked out all the glass in the Institute's main building. The concussion knocked most of the commandos instantly unconscious. Up it rose, an almost perfect sphere of fire and fury, expanding ever upward and outward, red-orange, its heat exploding the gas tanks of cars parked over 200 meters away. It rose unsparingly into the midnight sky, spreading its smoke and toxic fumes across most of northern Munich. Newman's portrait had come alive.